Dusk had come down blue over the pines when the first nurse noticed the shape outside the recovery room window. Nobody moved. The clinic sat at the edge of Moose Hollow Road in northern Maine, where the woods brushed the gutters when the wind was strong. That evening, the last snow of March fell in slow, wet flakes, touching the glass and sliding down like clear tears. Inside, the lights were low. A barred owl blinked in a covered crate. In the laundry room, the dryer knocked once, then settled. Mara Ellison had been rinsing a feeding syringe when she heard Lena whisper her name. Not call it. Whisper it. Mara. There was fear in the young volunteer's voice, but not the sharp kind. It was the kind that arrived when the heart recognized what the mind feared to believe. Mara dried her hands on the green towel in her scrub pocket. She stepped out of the washroom, still smelling of disinfectant, thawed mice, and peppermint tea gone cold beside her clipboard. Then she saw the paw on the window. One small, broad bobcat paw, damp with snowmelt, pressed flat against the outside pane. The pads were dark. The toes were spread slightly. A narrow notch marked the outer edge where an old injury had healed unevenly, leaving the shape of that paw as familiar to Mara as a signature. Behind it stood a bobcat with tufted ears, winter-thick fur, and pale green eyes that held the last light of the woods. 18 months had passed. Mara did not breathe right away. The others gathered slowly behind her. Doctor. Keene stopped with one hand on the medicine cabinet. Old Mister. Bell, who fixed fences for the clinic, removed his cap without knowing he had done it. Outside, the bobcat's whiskers trembled. Snow collected on her muzzle. One ear, the left one, held a tiny crescent tear near the tip. Her tail twitched once, short and measured, alive with a wild creature's private decision. Mara knew that tear. She knew the way the cat held her weight back on her right side when she was uncertain. She knew the slow blink that was not softness exactly, but not threat either. She knew the habit of testing a surface with one paw before deciding whether the world could be trusted. Juniper, Mara said. It was barely sound at all. The bobcat did not flinch from the name. She kept her paw against the glass, and the room seemed to become smaller around that single point of contact. Animals passed through the clinic like weather. Some arrived frightened and left stronger. Some were remembered by a number on a chart, a scar, a season. Wild animals were not promises. They came because they needed help, and if the help worked, they left. That was the kindness. That was the ache. Still, sometimes one life stepped so deeply into the quiet rooms of another that even letting go did not erase the shape it left behind. If this story touches gentle hearts far from those snowy pines, a quiet like or subscription helps, and the comments can hold, where each listener is watching from, and the animal name they still remember. No one at the clinic touched the glass. No one opened the door. That mattered. Juniper was not a house cat who had come home late for supper. She was a grown female bobcat, compact beneath her mottled coat with snow in her ear tufts and the forest written into every line of her body. Her eyes moved from Mara to the dim room, to the covered owl, to the steel counter, to the humming ceiling vent. She missed nothing. Bobcats rarely did. Then she did something that made Lena make a small sound behind her sleeve. Juniper lifted her paw, turned it sideways, and placed it back down a little higher on the glass. exactly over the faint, cloudy smudge where Mara had taped a paper snowflake and forgotten the mark. Mara almost smiled, because Juniper had always disliked clean surfaces. During recovery, she had knocked over fresh water just to drink from the shallow spill. She had ignored eto-epte bedding until it was wrinkled and entirely her own. She had once dragged a corner of the blue blanket into her food dish, then stared at Mara with such offended dignity that Mara had apologized to the cat, the blanket, and the room. Those memories rose so quickly that they hurt. Mara took one step closer. Not too close. She stopped, where the old floorboard dipped near the window, the one that gave a small complaining creak beneath her left shoe. The creak sounded exactly as it always had, and Juniperous whiskers pushed forward. For a year and a half, Mara had pictured Juniper in rain heat and January cold. She had imagined her under spruce roots, over stone walls, hunting before morning. She had hoped the Bobcat had forgotten the clinic, hoped it and dreaded it. Forgetting would mean she had become fully wild again. Remembering would mean some part of those months had traveled with her. Now Juniper stood on the other side of the glass. Not tame. Not asking to be kept. Not even safe in any simple human way. But she had come back. A tiny warmth moved through the room, fragile as steam from Mara's forgotten tea. Mr. Bell sniffed and blamed the cold draft. Lena stopped the clinic cat, a round gray creature named Button, from waddling into the hall with official suspicion in his eyes. The owl clicked his beak once, as if unimpressed by miracles that did not involve mice. Juniper turned her head at the sound, then looked past Mara toward the small sink, where the silver faucet dripped at its usual slow pace. One drop. Then another. Mara remembered how the Bobcat had once watched that faucet for 20 minutes, offended by every drip and yet unwilling to leave the mystery unsupervised. A breath shook out of Mara, almost a laugh, almost something else. She had spent half her life learning the language of not reaching. Hands that knew how to wrap a wound also had to know when to stay folded. Love, in that clinic, was measured in distance as often as touch. Juniper's paw slid slightly down the cold pane, leaving 4 clear trails through the fogged glass. The room held its breath with her. Then the Bobcat lowered her foot into the snow and sat back on her haunches, square and watchful, her pale eyes never leaving Mara's face. Long before Juniper returned to that window, Mara Ellison had learned how quiet a house could become after a life had shifted inside it. Her place stood 7 miles from the clinic, a narrow cedar-sided house, set back from the road behind 2 old apple trees and a mailbox shaped like a covered bridge. In summer, ferns crowded the porch steps. In winter, snow rose against the foundation until the windows seemed lower than they were. The house had belonged to her grandparents first, then her mother, and finally to Mara after the family had thinned down to photographs, recipes, and a rocking chair that creaked when no one sat in it. She was 42 then, with brown hair she usually twisted into a knot and forgot until it fell loose during night rounds. She had a small scar on her thumb from a frightened gull years before, and reading glasses that lived on top of her head more often than on her nose. Every morning, she drove Moose Hollow Road before sunrise with coffee in a steel thermos, a wool hat pulled low, and a habit of tapping twice on the steering wheel whenever she passed the frozen pond. The tapping had begun after her mother died. No one at the clinic knew that at first. They knew Mara as steady, Mara who could wrap a wing without raising her voice, Mara who remembered which squirrel refused formula unless it was warm enough, which fox kit panicked at the sound of zipper teeth, which raccoon learned latches faster than some volunteers learned the supply closet. She was the one who wrote notes in small, neat letters and taped reminders to cabinets with blue Painter S tape. She always carried peppermint tea in a chipped white mug, painted with a loon, though the loon had lost most of its beak in the dishwasher years earlier. At home, she ate simple suppers at the kitchen table: soup, toast, whatever vegetables had survived the week. Her orange barn cat, Amos, slept on the chair opposite her, with the deep confidence of a retired mayor. If Mara read aloud from patient charts, Amos opened one eye, as if giving a second medical opinion. If she forgot to set down a saucer for him, he rested one paw on the table edge and looked wounded enough to make her apologize. Those were the small sounds of her evenings. The kettle click. The stove hum. The soft thump of Amos jumping down too heavily for a cat who believed he was graceful. Sometimes Ranger Eli Porter stopped by with a repaired trap crate or a bag of feed the clinic had ordered through his department. Eli was 38, tall, quiet, and always smelled faintly of spruce and truck heater dust. He and Mara had known each other since high school, though their conversations had become easier after they both stopped, pretending they were less lonely than they were. He never pushed past her porch if she did not invite him in. Mara noticed that. She noticed everything like that. Her work had taught her that trust was not built by good intentions alone. It was built by repeated safety, by voices kept low, by hands that waited, by doors closed gently, by allowing a creature to remain frightened without punishing it for being afraid. The clinic itself was a converted farmhouse with a new treatment wing added onto the back. The floors were uneven, the hallway lights flickered during storms, and the laundry room always smelled faintly of bleach, no matter how many windows they opened. It was not beautiful in the way brochures liked things to be beautiful, but it held warmth. Volunteers brought muffins in mismatched tins. Dr. Keene wore socks with trout on them beneath his serious shoes. Lena labeled every storage bin with handwriting so round and cheerful that even sterile gauze seemed friendly. There was always some small comedy trying to survive beside the worry. A raven once stole Dr. Keene's pen and dropped it into the mop bucket. A young skunk refused every nesting box except the cardboard case from Mara's tea order. Button, the clinic cat, considered the printer his personal enemy and slapped the paper tray whenever it woke from sleep. Mara laughed at these things softly. Never for long, but enough. She had been a wildlife nurse for nearly 16 years. She had started after training as a veterinary technician, then stayed because wild patients demanded a kind of humility she trusted. Domestic animals often looked to people for comfort. Wild ones looked for exits. Their fear was honest. Their boundaries were clear. They did not forgive carelessness simply because a human meant well. A bobcat, especially, could make a room feel like forest. Mara had treated a few before Juniper. Usually they arrived under sedation, all muscle and silence, smelling of leaf litter, cold air, and a sharp wild musk that clung to gloves. Even weak ones carried themselves with some hidden dignity. Their ears turned before their heads did. Their eyes tracked reflections. Their paws, wide and soft underneath, could land without sound on metal tables if given half a chance. Mara respected them. She had never imagined one would come to know her footsteps. Before Juniper, the ache in Mara's life had no single dramatic shape. It was not loud. It was the empty chair after her mother's passing. It was the guest room she had once painted pale yellow for a child who never came, after doctors and paperwork and hope had tired her out. It was returning from the clinic to a house where nobody asked how the barred owl was doing, or whether the fox kit had gained weight. It was having tenderness, vacipite hat, nowhere permanent to place it. So she placed it carefully where she could. Into warmed towels. Into patient logs. into bowls set far enough away that a frightened animal could eat without feeling watched. Into the old blue recovery blanket she washed by hand because the machine pulled at one corner. Every rescued animal mattered to her, but she was careful not to claim them in her heart. She told new volunteers that their job was not to become unforgettable. Their job was to help the animal forget captivity. She believed that. Most days. Yet, on late winter nights, when she shut off the clinic lights and saw her reflection in the dark window, she sometimes wondered kep had a tay became of all the lives that passed through her hands. Whether the owl found a white pine, whether the fox crossed the ridge safe, whether the raccoon who hated grapes but loved pear slices still remembered the taste of rainwater. Then she would lock the door, check the latch twice, and drive home under stars sharp enough to make the whole sky feel awake. She had learned not to expect wild things to stay. She had not yet learned that one might leave and still carry her with it. The call came on a morning when the road looked erased. Snow had fallen through the night, not in a storming rage, but in that steady northern way that made every fence rail, mailbox, and black spruce branch disappear under one patient color. Mara had arrived at the clinic before sunrise and found the porch steps drifted over. She had shoveled a narrow path with one hand while balancing her loon mug in the other, because she trusted her footing more than she trusted a morning without tea. Inside, Button sat on the reception desk. Kepate had his tail curled around the appointment bell, looking deeply inconvenienced by winter. Mara had just warmed a towel for a young porcupine when the phone rang. Doctor. Keen answered first, listened, and looked through the treatment room doorway at Mara. Route 7, he said quietly after hanging up. Half-grown bobcat. Near the old logging turnout. Eli S. there. Mara set the towel down. The room seemed to sharpen around her. The hum of the refrigerator. The tick of sleet against the back window. The faint hay smell from a rabbit carrier by the wall. She had handled calls like that before, and still each one opened a small cold space in her chest. A bobcat on the roadside meant many things, none of them simple. Too weak to climb. Too young to keep moving. Too frightened to understand help. She gathered gloves, a crate, a heavy blanket, and the quietest voice she owned. Lena, who had been sweeping spilled birdseed into a dustpan, followed with a flashlight, though the sun was beginning to rise. The flashlight was unnecessary, but Lena held it like courage. Outside, Mara's truck coughed twice before starting. Amos had paw prints across the hood sometime during the night, and Mara noticed them even then, 4 little opinions pressed into frost. She brushed snow from the windshield with her sleeve, because the scraper had vanished again, probably under the passenger seat, with 3 pens and a granola bar she had been pretending not to know about. By the time they reached Route 7, the sky had turned the color of tin. Ranger Eli Porter stood near the logging turnout, with his truck lights flashing softly through the snow. He had placed orange cones behind him and kept passing cars slow. His hat was pulled low, and his beard held tiny white crystals at the edges. He did not wave big. He only lifted 2 fingers, the way people did when something alive was close, and fear had to be respected. Mara parked behind him. The bobcat lay half-tucked beside the plowed bank, where dirty snow had hardened into ridges. At first, she looked like part of the roadside itself, tawny and gray and dappled, with bits of broken ice clinging to her fur. Then her ear turned. That single movement changed everything. She was alive. Mara stopped several yards away. Lena stopped when Mara stopped, though her breath came fast enough to cloud her scarf. The bobcat lifted her head a little, not much, just enough to show pale green eyes beneath frost-dusted lashes and a left ear with a small crescent tear near the tip. Her whiskers were bent with ice. Her front paws were tucked beneath her, but one paw rested awkwardly in the snow. The outer edge held away as if the ground itself hurt. She did not snarl. That worried Mara more than snarling would have. A bobcat with strength often warned the world. This one watched in silence, and the silence was thin. "Found her sitting there when Mort came through," Eli said softly. She tried to move toward the trees, but she could get over the bank. Mara nodded. The woods began only 10 yards beyond the turnout. Spruce trunks stood close together, dark and waiting. To a human, it looked like cover. To the bobcat, it must have looked like the only honest place left in the world. Mara crouched. Not straight in front of her, but at an angle. "Easy," she said. The word was for herself as much as the animal. The bobcat's ears flattened. Her pupils widened. When Mara shifted her hand toward the blanket, the animal's gaze locked onto the glove with such fierce suspicion that Mara froze. There it was. Not hatred. Memory. Maybe. Instinct. Certainly. The old wild understanding that hands could trap, lift, hurt, or take away the last bit of choice a creature had. Mara lowered her hand into the snow. Behind her, Lena whispered, "She's beautiful." "She's scared," Mara murmured. Both were true. Eli moved slowly to the far side, using his body only to keep the bobcat from dragging herself toward traffic. He did not crowd her. He had been raised around working dogs and wild woods, and he knew the difference between helping and conquering. Snow squeaked under his boots. Somewhere high above them, a crow gave one dry, judgmental call. The first attempt failed. When Mara eased the blanket closer, the bobcat struck the air once with that injured paw, fast despite her weakness. Her claws caught only snow, scattering powder across Mara's sleeve. Lena startled and dropped the flashlight. It landed upright in a drift, still shining at the sky like it had decided to search heaven for instructions. Eli glanced at it. "Well," he said softly, "it's optimistic." Mara almost laughed, but did not. The tiny bit of humor warmed the sharp edge of the moment without breaking it. She waited. Waiting was often the first medicine. The bobcat breathed through parted lips, each breath shallow but steady. A small twig of juniper clung to the fur near her shoulder, green against the winter coat. Mara noticed it because noticing details kept fear from taking over. She noticed the twig, the torn ear, the uneven paw, the snow melting on the cat's nose. She noticed how the bobcat never once looked at the crate without looking for the trees immediately after. "Not a trap," Mara said, though she knew the animal could not understand the words. Just a little shelter from the road. The second time, Mara did not move the blanket toward the bobcat. She set it in the snow halfway between them and took her hands away. The bobcat stared at it. The wind lifted one corner. The fabric gave a soft flap, and the animal flinched as if the blanket had shown teeth. Then, after a long minute, her nose twitched. She smelled laundry soap, clinic heat, and other wild lives that had passed through, care and gone back out again. Mara looked down so her gaze would not press too hard. Her knees had begun to ache in the cold. Meltwater slipped into one boot. She thought of her mother then, unexpectedly, of the way she used to say that frightened creatures needed a room made of patience, even outdoors. At last, with Eli steady behind and Lena silent beside the truck, Mara lifted the blanket in a slow arc and let it fall over the Bobcat gently enough that the snow barely stirred. The cat twisted once beneath it. Then Mara had her. Not conquered. Held only because the road was worse. The Bobcat was lighter than she should have been. Beneath the blanket, her body felt all tension and fragile heat. She made one low sound, not a growl exactly, more like the forest closing a door. Mara carried her to the crate while Eli held it steady, and Lena whispered apologies to the flashlight before retrieving it from the drift. When the latch clicked, the Bobcat turned inside the crate and faced them. Her eyes burned from the dark. Mara crouched in front of the door, keeping her fingers away from the wire. "We Leglunk call you Juniper for now," she said, glancing at the green twig, still caught in the blanket fold. "Only for now. You don't to have to keep anything we give you." The Bobcat blinked once. Snow kept falling around the turnout, softening tire tracks, cones, boots, and fear. Behind them, the spruce woods stood quiet. Ahead of them waited the clinic, with its uneven floors, warm towels, and rules about distance that Mara trusted more than comfort. As Eli closed the truck door, Mara looked through the crate's side and saw Juniper watching her hands. Not her face. Her hands. Mara folded them in her lap for the whole drive back. The clinic changed its voice for Juniper. It did not become silent, because a wildlife clinic could never truly be silent. There was always the washer, the kettle breathing steam in the break room, a finch tapping at a recovery box, Button complaining from somewhere he had no business being. But around the back isolation room, everyone softened. Doors were eased shut with fingertips. Boots slowed before the threshold. Even Dr. Keene learned to clear his throat in the hallway. Juniper spent the first night in the lower steel kennel beneath a dim amber bulb. The room smelled of clean towels, pine shavings, and the sharp winter musk that came through the blanket with her. Snow had melted from her coat in little dark beads. When Mara crouched to check on her, the Bobcat pressed herself into the far rear corner and became almost flat, all ears and eyes, and held breath. She had not eaten. That did not surprise Mara. A trapped wild creature often treated food as another trick at first. Hunger could wait if fear was still standing in the room. Mara placed a shallow water dish near the front, then stopped herself. Too close. She moved it back with the end of a broom handle, slow enough that Juniper could track every inch of it. Then she set the first food bowl exactly 3 feet from the kennel door. Not because 3 feet was magic, but because it gave the cat space to approach without feeling caught. Lena watched from behind Mara's shoulder. "How do you know where to put it?" she whispered. "But don't," Mara said. "She'll tell us." Juniper told them by refusing to move until everyone had left. Only later, when Mara checked the small camera from the hallway, did she see the Bobcat unfold. First one paw, then the other. Her left ear twitched toward the door. Her nose tested the air in tiny pulls. She approached the bowl in a curved line, never straight, pausing twice to look at the dark window, and once to stare at the ceiling vent as if it had insulted her. Then she picked up a piece of food, carried it backward to the far corner, and ate with her body turned sideways. The next morning, the bowl was empty, The water dish had been shoved 6 inches to the left, and the blue recovery blanket had been dragged into a heap beneath the shelf. Juniper sat beside it like she had arranged furniture, according to ancient Bobcat law, and expected no criticism. Mara made a note on the chart. 8 overnight. Alert. Defensive. Strong preference for interior design. Doctor. Keene read the note and looked at her over his glasses. Medical terminology has grown friendlier since Mort trained, he said. She was very clear, Mara answered. Later he added a tiny pencil sketch of a chair beside the word interior. It was a terrible chair, all crooked legs, and Lena laughed into the supply cabinet. The laughter stayed outside Juniper S' room, soft and careful, but it warmed the long morning. Trust did not arrive as a single event. It came in fractions, so small some people would have missed them. On the 3rd day, Juniper stopped striking the wire when Mara entered with water. On the 5th, she stayed on the shelf instead of flattening into the corner. On the 7th, she let Mara change the soiled towel without throwing her whole body against the back wall, though she kept her mouth open in warning and gave one dry hiss that made Button retreat from the hallway with offended dignity. He sat behind the reception desk for an hour afterward, pretending the retreat had been his idea. Mara did not laugh until she was safely in the laundry room. Each little improvement cost Juniper effort. Mara could see that. The Bobcat's pupils widened whenever a sleeve brushed metal. Her whiskers angled forward at the smallest sound. If a truck passed outside, she crouched so low, her spotted shoulders seemed to melt into the blanket. A wild animal did not stop being afraid because a human had kind hands. Fear was older than kindness. So Mara kept proving the same simple things. The door would open slowly. The bowl would land 3 feet away. The hand would withdraw. The voice would stay low. No one would reach unless there was no other choice. During treatments, they used a divider panel whenever possible, giving Juniper one dark half of the kennel while they cleaned the other. Mara wore the same faded green overshirt every morning because sudden changes unsettled the cat. She stopped wearing her jangling key, ringed a mote fay her waist and tucked it into her pocket instead. She learned ve kep hat, hat. Floorboard creaked and stepped around it, though sometimes Juniper seemed to notice the absence of the creak as much as the sound. One evening, while freezing rain stitched the windows with silver threads, Mara brought in a clean towel and found the blue blanket pushed close to the front of the kennel. Not all the way, just close enough to be noticed. Juniper sat behind it, upright, tail wrapped around her paws, pale eyes fixed on Mara's face. Mara stopped. Somewhere down the hall, Lena was singing off-key to a box of orphan squirrels. Juniper only turned one ear, then turned it back. Mara crouched. "You moved it," she said softly. Juniper blinked, slow but not sleepy. Mara did not touch the blanket. She did not thank the cat as if Juniper had offered a gift. That would have been too human, too easy. Instead, she placed the bowl at its usual distance and sat back on her heels for one extra breath before leaving. In the hall, she leaned against the wall. Her chest hurt in a way she did not want to name. She had spent years telling herself that good care meant not needing anything from the animal in return. And it was true. Yet that small movement of the blanket, that rearrangement in the language of a frightened bobcat, felt like a hand laid gently over an old lonely place inside her. Not healing it, just finding it. That night, the camera showed Juniper eating nearer to the front than before. She still carried each piece back to the corner, because dignity had rules. But once, after swallowing, she looked toward the door. The bowl remained 3 feet from the threshold. The distance stayed. And inside that distance, something careful began to live. The first true change came on a Tuesday that smelled of wet wool and cedar shavings. A thaw had moved through Moose Hollow during the night, softening the snowbanks and setting the clinic roof to dripping. Water ticked from the eaves in uneven rhythms, and every person who came through the back door brought in damp boot prints shaped like dark leaves. Mara had arrived with her hair escaping its knot, and her loon mug tucked against her chest, trying not to spill tea while Button escorted her down the hallway as if he had been hired to inspect morale. Juniper was on the shelf when Mara entered the isolation room. Not in the corner. Not crouched flat beneath the shadow. On the shelf. Her body remained tight, paws tucked, tail tip curled close to one haunch. But she had chosen height over hiding, and that mattered. Bobcats liked to see the world before the world saw them. Even inside a steel kennel, Juniper had remembered she was made for ledges, branches, fallen logs, and the silent advantage of being above trouble. Mara paused with one hand on the doorframe. "Morning," she said softly. Juniper's left ear turned at the sound. Her pale eyes followed Mara's hands first, then her face, then the bucket of fresh water. The order had become familiar. Hands, face, object. Mara accepted this ranking without complaint. She set the bucket on the rubber mat and crouched by the kennel door. The room held the sweet, dry smell of cedar, the metallic scent of clean bowls, and the faint sharpness of wild fur. Somewhere beyond the wall, Lena laughed under her breath at something Dr. Keene had said, then hushed herself quickly. Juniper did not retreat. Mara slid the divider panel into place, giving the bobcat the back half of the kennel. Usually, Juniper answered the scrape of the panel with a hiss or a quick strike at the empty air, more warning than attack, a reminder that her boundaries had claws. This time, her shoulders lowered, but her paws stayed still. Mara noticed. She did not show that she noticed. That was another skill the clinic had taught her. Celebration could frighten a wild thing as maushe hot as anger. A gasp, a sudden smile, a hand lifted too fast. Any human joy could become pressure if it asked the animal to understand it. So Mara cleaned the front half slowly. She changed the towel, wiped the floor, replaced the water pan, and a loose thread hung from her green overshirt cuff. Juniper's gaze fixed on it with grave attention, as if the thread might make a dangerous decision. Mara tucked it in carefully. "No loose monsters today," she murmured. In the hallway, Button sneezed once. Juniper's whiskers pushed forward. Mara let warmth move through her chest, but not into her hands. Her hands stayed plain and useful. They lifted the old towel. They placed the clean one. They set the bowl exactly 3 feet from the door, because some promises were made in measurements. Then the water pan clicked against the kennel floor. Juniper looked at it. Mara looked down at her own knee. The bobcat shifted, only slightly. The shelf gave a small metal sound under her weight. Mara kept her breath even. Juniper climbed down from the shelf. She did it with the careful reluctance of an animal who had not agreed to anything larger than this single movement. One paw descended, then the other. Her injured outer toe, the notched one, touched the floor last. She held it light for a moment, testing. Then she stepped toward the divider panel. Mara should have finished and left. She knew that. A good nurse did not linger because a lonely part of her wanted a story to unfold in front of her. A good nurse gave space, ended on success, and let the wild creature keep the room she had earned. Still, Mara stayed one breath longer. Not reaching. Not speaking. Only present. Juniper lowered her head to the water pan. She did not drink. Instead, she rested her marked paw on the rim, spreading her toes over the cool steel. The pan tipped a little, and water trembled in a bright circle. Mara's throat tightened. It was the first time that paw had come forward without striking. The first time it had touched something near Mara's hands without warning the world away. Juniper held it there, not gentle exactly, but undecided. Her claws remained half hidden. Her ears stayed angled back. Every part of her body said she could still vanish into herself if the room became unsafe. Mara looked at the paw, then away. "Good," she whispered, so softly it barely touched the air. Juniper's whiskers trembled. She dipped her nose and drank once, twice, 3 times, with her paw still resting on the rim as if she needed to hold the water still. Behind the door window, Lena appeared and froze with folded towels against her chin. "Doctor." Keen stopped beside her, and even he did not make a joke. Button tried to squeeze between their legs, discovered the door was closed, and sat down with the heavy disappointment of a cat, denied important gossip. Mara finished by sliding the fresh food bowl into place. Her wrist moved too close to the pan. Juniper lifted her paw at once. Mara stopped. For one clear second, Nurse and Bobcat held the same small decision between them. Then Juniper did not strike. She withdrew the paw slowly and placed it beneath her chest. Mara backed away first. That seemed right. Trust, if it was beginning, should not be asked to carry too much weight. It should be allowed to remain tiny and alive, like a coal cupped from wind. Outside, meltwater kept dripping from the roof. Inside, Lena pressed both hands over her mouth and turned down the hall before her feelings became too loud. "Doctor." Keen pretended to study a clipboard upside down. Mara went to the washroom and rinsed a bowl that was already clean. She stood there with warm water running over her fingers, thinking of the empty yellow room at home, the quiet chair across from her table, the long practice of not needing to be chosen. Juniper had not chosen her, not in any human way. But the paw had stayed down. And for Mara, that was enough to carry through the rest of the day, like a hidden light. By the second week, Juniper had made the isolation room her country. It was not large. A person could cross it in 6 steps, 7, if avoiding the creaky board near the sink. There was one high window with wired glass, one lower observation window facing the hall, a steel kennel, a shelf, a drain, and a cupboard that refused to stay closed, unless someone lifted the handle and nudged it twice with a hip. To Juniper, it became cliffs, cover, weather, and border. The shelf was her ridge. The blue blanket was her thicket. The water pan was a private pond that required inspection before every drink. The food bowl, placed 3 feet from the door, was acceptable only if it arrived without ceremony and left without argument. If Mara moved it half an inch too far left, Juniper stared at the bowl first, then at Mara, with the grave disappointment of a forest judge. Mara began to understand that Juniper's silence had different shapes. There was the flat silence of fear when the bobcat pressed low and made herself small enough to disappear into her own spots. There was the sharp silence of warning when her ears narrowed and the air around her seemed to tighten. And there was a newer silence, one Mara barely trusted herself to name. When Juniper watched without panic, her tail tip moving slowly against the blanket, as if the room had become something worth studying rather than escaping. The clinic adjusted around her. Mornings began before light. Mara arrived vekepite hat her loon mug and a thermos of broth for a fox kit in another room. The back steps smelled of wet pine needles, old snow, and the faint smoke from Mr. Bell's wood stove across the road. Inside, Lena had usually left a note on the counter in her round handwriting. Juniper shifted blanket north, or Juniper offended by mop, or once, simply, she sneezed and scared herself. Mara kept every note. She should not have. Maybe. Patient files were patient files, not scrapbooks. But she folded the smallest ones into the back of Juniper's chart, behind medication times and weight checks, where no one had to see that a few cheerful sentences could steady her whole morning. Juniper's care became a set of rituals, and rituals suited them both. Mara washed her hands, warmed the food, checked the chart, removed her key ring, and entered without looking straight at the bobcat. Juniper watched from the shelf. If Mara forgot to say morning, Juniper's ears tilted in a way that made Mara feel oddly corrected. If Mara said it too brightly, Juniper retreated to the blanket and ignored breakfast for 20 minutes. So the greeting stayed soft. Morning, Juniper. Not sweet. Not pleading. Just the same. Medicine days were harder. Juniper did not forgive the treatment gloves, though she tolerated the divider panel with increasing dignity. Once, when Dr. Keene prepared a dose, Juniper reached through the gap vekepite hat, one paw, and hooked the edge of his clipboard, pulling it hard enough that his trout socks nearly slid on the wet floor. He looked at the bent chart paper. She has opinions about dosage, he said. Mara retrieved the clipboard carefully. Juniper sat back, tail wrapped around her paws, looking not guilty at all. Lena later drew a tiny warning sign on a sticky note and placed it above the supply shelf. Bobcat Review's paperwork. The sign stayed there until the tape gave out. 3 warmths grew inside those ordinary days. The first was Juniper's dislike of the yellow towel. She accepted white towels. She accepted gray. She tolerated the old blue blanket like a queen, tolerating a loyal guard. But the yellow towel made her flatten her ears and push it firmly into the corner with both front paws, as if burying an insult. Mara tried it twice, then retired it to the laundry room, where Button slept on it immediately and seemed proud to enjoy what the bobcat had rejected. The second was the faucet. The isolation sink had a slow drip no wrench could fully cure. At first the sound made Juniper tense. Then, one afternoon, Mara found her sitting below it, head tilted, eyes narrowed with intense suspicion. A drop fell. Juniper blinked. Another drop fell. She lifted one paw and struck the air after it, missing completely, then looked toward Mara as if the nurse had arranged this embarrassment. Mara kept her mouth serious until she reached the hall. The third was Mara's left boot. The sole had begun to peel, and when she walked down the hallway, one step made a soft scuff, followed by a tiny flap. Scuff flap, scuff flap. She meant to repair it. She truly did. But one morning, before she reached Juniper's door, the bobcat rose from the shelf and faced the hall window before Mara appeared. Lena noticed first. "She knows your boot," she whispered. Mara stopped outside the glass. Inside, Juniper's ears were forward. not relaxed. Never fully that. But waiting. After that, Mara did not fix the boot for another month. At home, her evenings changed too, though nothing obvious moved. She still ate soup at the kitchen table. Amos still claimed the opposite chair and leaned one orange elbow over the edge as if he were reviewing her manners. The kettle still clicked off too loudly. The yellow room still held its folded quilt and dust motes and silence. But Mara found herself less afraid of the quiet. She had Juniper S. chart open beside her bowl, and she made notes while Amos tried to lie across the page. She described appetite, posture, paw use, response to sound. Then, sometimes, she wrote things that were not medical at all. Watched snow for 12 minutes. Moved blanket near door again. Did not strike. She knew better than to build a private comfort out of a wild animal-s recovery. Juniper was not there to mend Mara. The Bobcat had not been sent by the woods to fill an empty chair or answer an old sorrow. Mara reminded herself of that whenever tenderness became too warm in her chest. Still, care had a way of lighting two rooms at once. One evening, as sleet tapped softly against the clinic window, Mara sat on the hallway floor outside Juniper S. room with inventory sheets in her lap. She did not sit there for Juniper. Not officially. The hall was simply warmer than the office, and the overhead light buzzed less. That was what she told herself. Inside, Juniper climbed down from the shelf. Scuff-flap, Mara S. boot had said earlier. Bowl 3 feet away. Voice low. Door gentle. Same day after same day. The Bobcat walked to the observation glass and sat with her side turned close enough that Mara could see the pale fur along her cheek and the crescent tear in her ear. Juniper did not press against it. She did not ask for touch. She only stayed. Mara lowered her pencil. For a long while, woman and Bobcat rested on opposite sides of a window that neither tried to cross. The clinic hummed around them. A washer spun. Button snored on the forbidden yellow towel. Somewhere in the back room, a young fox kit dreamed loudly enough to squeak. Mara smiled without meaning to. Daily life, she had learned, was where trust hid itself. Not in grand gestures. Not in sudden miracles. In bowls placed carefully. In doors that did not slam. In the same imperfect boot, making the same small sound down the hall. And in a wild Bobcat deciding, just for that evening, not to move away. The window game began so quietly that Mara almost missed it. It happened late one afternoon, after a soft new snow had started falling over Moose Hollow. Not the heavy roadside snow that bent branches and buried ditches, but a gentle kind, loose and wandering, each flake catching the clinic light before vanishing against the glass. The recovery room smelled of clean straw, warm metal, and the faint peppermint from Mara's mug cooling on the counter. Outside, the pines stood dark and still, their boughs carrying white along every needle. Juniper had been moved from the lower isolation kennel into the larger recovery room by then, not because she was tame, and never because anyone forgot what she was, but because her body had begun asking for more space. Her paw had strengthened. Her coat had filled out. Her eyes had grown clearer, colder, more awake. She could leap to the low platform now, then to the higher shelf, and from there she watched every corner of the room like a small queen of winter who had not approved the architecture. Mara had added a spruce branch for scent and cover. Juniper inspected it for nearly an hour, sniffing each twig. rubbing one cheek against the bark only after everyone had left, then dragging the branch 3 inches closer to the window, as if improving the forest herself. "She has rearranged the wilderness, Doctor," Keene said when he saw it. Mara wrote, "Uses cover well, active, curious." Then, below that, after a pause, she added, "particular." The lower window faced the back slope, where snow gathered against a line of young birches. For several days, Juniper ignored it. She preferred the shelf, the shadowed corner, the blue blanket folded beneath the platform. But on that afternoon, as Mara sat on a stool outside the half-open inner door reviewing supply orders, she heard one small sound. Tap. Not the faucet. Not sleet. Not button assaulting the printer. Tap. Mara lifted her eyes. Juniper sat near the window, body tall but relaxed into itself, tail tip making one slow curve against the floor. Her ears pointed forward. Her whiskers stood out like fine white threads. A snowflake had touched the outside of the pane, and Juniper had lifted one paw to meet it from the other side. Tap. Another flake landed. Another paw touch answered. Mara did not move. She had learned that joy could be too loud if a person let it escape all at once, so she stayed on the stool, one hand resting on the clipboard, the other wrapped around her chipped loon mug. The tea had gone lukewarm, but she drank it anyway because something in her needed an ordinary action to hold on to. Juniper tilted her head. The next snowflake slid down the glass instead of sticking. Juniper followed it with her paw, pads whispering against the pane, and, when it disappeared at the sill, she looked behind the radiator as if the flake might have trespassed indoors. Mara pressed her lips together. In the hallway, Lena appeared with a basket of towels and froze. Her eyes widened. Mara raised one finger gently, not to scold, only to hold the moment in place. Lena nodded. They kept such seriousness that the towels nearly tipped out of her arms. Tap. Juniper touched the glass again. The sound was barely anything, but it filled the room better than laughter. After that, the window became part of Juniper's day. Not every day. She was still a bobcat, ruled by her own weather. Some mornings, she ignored the world beyond the pane entirely and spent 20 minutes dismantling the edge of a cardboard enrichment box with precise, offended bites. Other times, she sat vacante, had her back to the room, and watched chickadees flick through the birches, her body becoming so still that Mara felt she was seeing a wild patience really looked like. But when snow fell, Juniper noticed. She never chased wildly. She never batted like a kitten. Her movements were careful, economical, and strangely dignified. A paw lifted. A pad touched the glass. A flake vanished. Her ears twitched once, as though the universe had made a small error she intended to document. The clinic staff began pretending not to gather. Doctor. Keene suddenly had reasons to check the thermometer. Lena remembered towels that did not need folding. Mr. Bell came to repair a loose hinge and took 14 minutes to tighten one screw because snow had started falling and Juniper was at the window. Button, excluded from the room for reasons he considered unjust, sat outside the hall glass and watched Juniper kept hot round yellow eyes. Once, when Juniper tapped at a flake, Button lifted his kept no paw and tapped the inside hallway window. Juniper turned her head slowly toward him. Button lowered his paw. He then washed his chest with exaggerated indifference. Mara laughed so softly it hardly disturbed the air. Those were the days that taught her how lightness could live beside caution. Nothing about Juniper's recovery became simple. The Bobcat still startled at dropped pans. She still pinned her ears when anyone unfamiliar approached. She still carried food to the blue blanket before eating, as if the meal had to be claimed in private territory. Her wildness had not faded. If anything, it had grown brighter as her strength returned. Yet joy came anyway. It came when Juniper discovered that the stainless steel bowl made a different sound upside down, and spent one evening pushing it with one paw, pausing after each scrape to judge the echo. It came when Lena accidentally wore a hat with a bobble on top, and Juniper stared at it so intensely that Lena backed out of the room whispering, "Won't understand." It was a mistake. It came when Mara found one perfect paw print in spilled cedar dust, and left it there until closing, unable to sweep it away before everyone had seen. At home, Mara began looking at her own windows differently. She would stand at the kitchen sink after supper, Amos heavy on the rug behind her, and watch snow collect on the dark glass. For years, winter evenings had made the house feel larger than she wanted it to be. The yellow room stayed shut. Her mother's rocking chair held its silence. The apple trees outside became shadows hot empty arms. But now, when flakes touched the pane, she thought of Juniper's paw rising to meet them. Not with need. Not with affection meant for a human. Simply with attention. And somehow, that was enough to soften the edges of the night. Mara had spent so long believing that comfort had to come from being chosen, held, answered. Juniper offered none of those things. She offered presence, and only when she wished. She offered the small trust of turning her side instead of her teeth. She offered the quiet wonder of a wild animal pausing before a window because Snow had asked a question. One evening, Mara stayed late after everyone had gone. The clinic settled into its nighttime sounds, dryer tumbling, owl shifting in a crate, old pipes clicking as heat moved through them. Juniper sat at the window while snow fell through the porch light outside. Mara stood in the doorway, far enough away. A flake landed. Juniper touched it. The paw left a faint oval mark on the glass, then withdrew. Mara looked at that mark for a long time after Juniper had climbed back to her shelf and tucked herself into shadow. She did not wipe it clean. Spring did not arrive all at once in Moose Hollow. It loosened the world by inches. First, the snowbanks drew back from the clinic porch, leaving gray tunnels underneath where meltwater whispered all day. Then the birches showed a faint green haze at their tips. The air began to smell less like iron cold and more like wet bark, thawing soil, and last autumn's leaves waking under the sun. By afternoon, the roof dripped steadily into a dented bucket Mr. Bell placed near the back steps, and every drop sounded like a clock Mara did not want to hear. Juniper heard it too. She had changed with the weather. Her coat, once dull and clumped from roadside weakness, now carried a rich mottled pattern of tawny gray, cream, and shadowed brown. The crescent tear in her left ear remained, clean-edged and unmistakable. Her notched paw had strengthened enough that she could spring from platform to shelf with only the slightest pause before landing. Her eyes had sharpened into something more distant than recovery. Something that belonged outside. Mara noticed first during the move to the outdoor enclosure. The enclosure stood behind the clinic, built along the edge of the pines, with climbing logs, brush piles, shaded corners, and a double-gated entry that Mr. Bell checked every morning with the seriousness of a lighthouse keeper. It was designed for healing animals who needed weather again before freedom, Squirrels had raced through it. Foxes had hidden in its grass. Once, a young fisher had made every volunteer question their career choices. Juniper entered in a covered transfer crate. No one spoke much. When the crate door opened, she did not rush out. She stayed inside, nostrils moving, ears turning, body gathered like a question. The air carried damp pine, mouse trails beneath leaf litter, the far-off smoke of someone's stove, and the bright mineral smell of melting snow. A chickadee called from above, 2 notes clear as glass. Juniper stepped out. One paw. Then another. She froze with all 4 feet in the open and lifted her head toward the trees. Mara stood behind the inner gate, hands folded. She felt the old ache open quietly in her chest. She had wanted this moment. She had worked for it through medicine, distance, patience, and every bowl placed 3 feet from a door. Yet when Juniper smelled the forest and remembered herself, Mara felt the first small grief of success. Juniper moved along the fence line, not frantic, not panicked, but exact. She placed her paws silently. Despite the damp leaves, she tested the climbing log. She rubbed her cheek once against a pine branch, leaving scent as if signing her name on a border she had not yet accepted. Then she turned toward the clinic window and stared. Lena stood inside with a clipboard clutched to her chest. Juniper's ears flicked. Lena lifted one hand slowly, then seemed to realize she was waving at a bobcat and lowered it with embarrassment. Juniper looked away, unimpressed. Button watched from the office window and gave a single dramatic yawn, as though outdoor enclosures were beneath his administrative rank. For a few days, the arrangement seemed almost peaceful. Juniper slept in the brush pile during warm afternoons. She climbed to the highest log at a motte bay dusk and watched shadows gather among the trunks. She investigated every corner of the enclosure with the grave precision of a surveyor. She disliked the hanging enrichment pouch so thoroughly that she removed it from its hook and buried it beneath leaves. Mr. Bell called that a formal complaint. Mara wrote the note down. Active, strong, interested in natural cover, increasing response to woodland sounds. She did not write the sentence that mattered most. Wanting out. It showed in small ways at first. Juniper stopped tapping snowflakes because there were no snowflakes left. Instead, she watched the tree line beyond the mesh, her body angled toward the woods whenever the wind moved through them. At feeding time, she ate quickly, then returned to the far corner where a young spruce pressed close to the fence. She no longer carried each piece of food back to the blue blanket, because the blanket stayed inside now, folded near the recovery room shelf like an old season. Mara brought it once, thinking the familiar scent might comfort her. Juniper sniffed it, pawed it twice, and walked away. Mara stood with the blanket in her hands and understood more than she wanted to. Wildness was not ingratitude. It was health. Still, the understanding did not spare her. At home, she began leaving the kitchen window open, a crack even when the nights were cold. Amos objected by sitting on the sill and puffing himself into a displeased orange loaf. The peepers had begun calling from the low marsh beyond the apple trees, thin silver voices rising after dark. Mara washed her supper bowl and listened, thinking of Juniper hearing the same night from behind mesh. She wondered whether the bobcat knew the difference between waiting and being held. She wondered whether she herself did. The warning signs grew clearer as April deepened. Juniper paced the enclosure at dawn, always the same path. Along the north fence, around the brush pile, up the log, down again, pause at the spruce, back along the gate. Her paws left faint ovals in the soft earth. When a wild tom bobcat called somewhere beyond the ridge one evening, Juniper went so still that Mara felt every person in the clinic disappear from her awareness. The call came again, low and rough through the pines. Juniper answered without sound. Her body answered. Her ears. Her lifted head. The long stillness in her spine. Mara watched from the shadow of the supply shed. Eli had come by to examine the release site maps, and he stood beside her with one thumb hooked in his belt. "She's close," he said. Mara nodded. A gust moved through the trees, shaking old rain from the needles. The drops fell around the enclosure in a soft, scattered hush. Juniper did not look back at the clinic. That night, Mara stayed late to check the gate latch twice, then a third time. Mr. Bell had oiled it that morning. It shut cleanly, with a firm metal catch. She pressed it again anyway. Inside, Lena had left muffins in the break room, each one slightly sunken in the middle. Dr. Keene ate two and declared them medically necessary. Button stole a crumb and behaved as if he had hunted it himself. Small warmths kept happening, stubborn as spring flowers near snow. But Mara's heart had become quiet. She carried the blue blanket to the laundry room and folded it slowly. Its corners were worn. One edge still held a few pale hairs caught in the weave. She smoothed them with her thumb, then stopped, ashamed of the wish rising in her. She wanted Juniper strong. She wanted Juniper free. She wanted one more winter afternoon vey, Kepite hat snow on the glass, and a paw lifting to meet it. All three wants lived together, and none of them made the others disappear. Outside, beyond the clinic walls, Juniper moved again along the fence line. Silent, restless, beautiful. Her shape passed between pine shadows and early moonlight. Not a patient becoming tame, but a wild creature remembering the exact size of the world. The night Juniper vanished, the rain came sideways. It began after sunset as a restless tapping on the clinic roof, then grew into a spring storm that pushed cold water under the back door. The pines behind the enclosure bent and lifted, their black branches moving like great animals in the dark. By 9 o'clock, the power had flickered twice. Mara should have gone home. Dr. Keene had told her so. Lena had texted umbrella symbols followed by, "Please do not sleep at the clinic again." Even Amos, waiting in the cedar house, would have been seated in the kitchen window, preparing a speech about supper. But Mara stayed. She told herself it was because storms unsettled patience. The owl in the covered crate had shifted every time thunder rolled. A fox kit with a healing shoulder had refused to settle unless the hallway light stayed on. Button had hidden inside the towel cabinet and hissed whenever anyone opened it. And Juniper was outside. Mara checked the enclosure before the storm became dangerous. She wore Eli's rain jacket and stepped through the mud with a flashlight tucked under her chin while she worked the gate latch vey, Kepite hot both hands. The metal was slick and cold. Rain ran from her hair into her collar. Juniper sat beneath the brush shelter, nearly invisible except for her eyes. They caught the flashlight once, green and bright, then disappeared as she turned her head. She did not crouch in panic. She listened. Her ears moved with the storm, catching every branch scrape, every gutter rattle, every distant crack of thunder. A wild creature did not hear weather as background. She heard it as messages. "You all right," Mara said, knowing the words were not the thing that mattered. Juniper's tail tip moved once. Mara checked the north fence, the corner posts, the double gate, and the latch Mr. Bell had oiled so carefully. She pressed it shut, lifted, pressed again. It held. To be certain, she looped a safety chain through the outer ring. The chain clinked in the rain, a small, stubborn sound. Back inside, Mara hung the jacket near the laundry room, where it dripped onto the tile. She warmed her hands around the loon mug, though the tea tasted more like metal than peppermint. Dr. Keene called from home to ask if the roof had given up yet. Mara told him no. Lena sent another text. Button has probably filed a complaint. Mara found Button asleep in the cabinet with one pave cap over his eyes and replied, "Complaint pending." There was still humor in the building then. Small, damp, tired humor. Near midnight, the storm changed. The rain thinned, but the wind sharpened. It came down from the ridge in sudden blows, making the clinic windows shiver. Mara had just finished changing the Foxkit-S bedding when a crack split the dark outside. Not thunder. Wood. She froze with the towel in her hands. A second sound followed, lower and heavier, somewhere behind the clinic. The lights flickered once, went dim, and brightened again. Mara ran. She did not take the time to put on Eli's rain jacket. She grabbed the flashlight, shoved her feet into boots, and pushed through the back door into a world of flying needles and cold mist. Somewhere, a loose shutter banged against the treatment wing with a hollow rhythm. The enclosure came into view in pieces. Fence. Spruce. Gate. Branch. At first, Mara could not understand what she was seeing. A cedar limb had fallen from the old tree beyond the north corner and crashed across the outer gate. Not a whole tree, not enough to destroy everything, but enough. One heavy end lay against the latch post. The safety chain hung twisted. The gate itself stood open by the width of a body. Mara stopped so suddenly one bay oote slid in the mud. "No," she said. The word disappeared in the wind. Her flashlight found the ground. Wet paw prints crossed the mud inside the gate, small and round, pressed deep where Juniper had gathered herself. They did not wander. They did not circle in confusion. They went straight through the opening, paused once outside the fence near the fallen cedar, then turned toward the pines. Mara followed them with the light until the forest swallowed the marks. The enclosure was empty. For a moment, she could not move. The storm touched everything at once. Rain on her face, mud against her ankles, the cedar smell sharp from the broken limb, her own heartbeat too loud in her ears. She had imagined Juniper's release 100 times. A clear morning, Eli beside the transport crate, Dr. Keene pretending not to be emotional, Lena crying into her sleeve, the gate opening because they had chosen it. Not this. Not a bent latch in the dark. Then the flashlight beam caught a patch of blue. Mara stepped closer. The old recovery blanket, the one she had folded in the laundry room, had somehow been carried outside earlier that evening with the extra towels. The wind must have dragged it from the crate beside the shed. Now one corner was snagged on torn cedar bark near the gate, soaked through, fluttering hard enough to sound alive. Mara took it in both hands. For one foolish second, she thought of Juniper dragging it there. Thought of the Bobcat choosing one last familiar thing before the woods. Then she made herself let that thought go. Wild animals did not arrange goodbyes for human hearts. People did that to survive losing them. Still, she held the blanket against her chest. Inside the clinic, the fox kit squeaked. The shutter banged. Button, brave now that the crisis was outside, appeared at the back door window as a gray silhouette kept ite hot offended ears. Mara almost laughed and almost broke. She forced herself to act. She closed the damaged gate, wedged the fallen branch away from the opening, and called Eli with fingers numb from rain. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. She gave facts. Cedar limb. North corner. Gate opened. Tracks into pines. Juniper gone. When she ended the call, she stood beneath the broken tree and looked toward the dark woods. Part of her wanted to run after the paw prints. The trained part of her knew better. Night, storm, frightened bobcat, slick ground. Chasing would not bring Juniper back. It might push her farther. So Mara stayed at the edge of the enclosure, shaking, with the blue blanket folded in her arms and the open forest breathing beyond the light. By dawn, the storm had spent itself, but it had taken the trail with it. The world behind the clinic looked rinsed and unfamiliar. Rainwater hung from every spruce needle. The ground shone black where mud had opened beneath the last patches of snow. The fallen cedar limb lay beside the enclosure like a tired animal, its broken heartwood pale and raw in the gray light. Mara stood at the north gate with Eli, Dr. Keene, Lena, and Mr. Bell, all of them quiet in the way people became quiet when blame had nowhere useful to land. Juniper's paw prints were still visible near the opening. 4 clear marks in mud. Then 3. Then 2 blurred hollows where the rain had softened the edges. Beyond that, the forest floor turned to wet leaves, pine needles, and stone. Eli crouched, one hand braced on his knee. He did not touch the tracks. He only leaned close and followed them with his eyes. She went uphill, he said. Mara nodded, though the words seemed to come from far away. Of course Juniper had gone uphill. Bobcats liked cover, height, and routes that let them vanish before being seen. Even injured, even startled, she would choose shadowed ground and fallen logs over open trail. Mara knew that. She had written those words in volunteer manuals. She had taught them calmly to others. Now, the knowledge felt like a door closing. They searched carefully, not loudly. Eli led through the trees with the slow patience of a man who knew the woods could hide what it loved. Mara followed several steps behind, carrying a small pack with a towel, gloves, and a radio she hoped not to use. Lena stayed near the clinic at first, checking the outer fence and calling local road crews. Dr. Keene phoned neighboring farms and asked them to report sightings without approaching. Mr. Bell repaired the gate with his jaw set so tightly that nobody told him he had put his pencil behind his ear and spent 10 minutes looking for it. That small mistake made Lena laugh once, then cry because she had laughed. Mister. Bell patted her shoulder with the pencil, still above his ear. She'll make fools of us yet, he said softly. Mara wanted that to be true. By mid-morning they found one sign near the old stone wall, a faint smear of mud on the top rock, then a single paw print in moss on the other side. Juniper had crossed there, cleanly, strongly enough to climb. The notched edge of the paw showed in the moss, unmistakable. A small broken curve Mara had cleaned and watched and learned. She knelt beside it. For one moment, she forgot everyone else. The moss smelled cold and green beneath the rain. A black-capped chickadee hopped along a branch overhead, too busy with spring to honor anyone's sorrow. Somewhere beyond the ridge, water rushed in a swollen ditch. Mara placed her hand near the print, not over it. The paw was smaller than her palm. It had carried Juniper away. Eli waited until she stood. They moved on. The trail faded near the logging road. That was the hardest part. Not finding fur caught on bark. Not seeing signs of struggle. Nothing dramatic enough to become certainty. Only absence. Only the woods taking back every clue until Juniper became what she had always been meant to be, unseen. They searched drainage ditches, culverts, and the sheltered sides of blowdowns. They walked the edge of Route 7, where snow still lay dirty beside the shoulder. Every dark root became a curled body for one terrible second. Every flicker between trees made Mara's breath stop. Once, a hare burst from cover and ran so fast through the brush that Lena yelped and dropped the radio. The radio landed in wet leaves and immediately began speaking in Eli's own recorded weather alert, which startled Lena worse. Dr. Keene picked it up, wiped it on his coat, and said, "At least the equipment remains dramatic." Even Mara smiled faintly. The smile vanished almost as soon as it came, but it had been there. A little warmth, stubborn and ridiculous. Like Button, later, refusing to leave Juniper's empty recovery room and sitting in the middle of the floor with the stern posture of a guard who had arrived too late. By evening, the search widened. Neighbors called with maybes, a shape near the sap shed, eyes behind a barn, tracks by a chicken coop that turned out to belong to a large house cat named Pickle, who accepted the attention with shameless pride. Eli checked each report. Mara went with him until Dr. Keene made her sit in the clinic kitchen and drink soup from a paper cup. The soup tasted of salt and cardboard. She held it anyway. Lena had folded the blue blanket and placed it on the chair beside Mara, as if the blanket had also needed somewhere to sit. Its damp corners had dried stiff. A few cedar needles clung to one edge. Mara touched them with her thumb. She kept thinking of the window game. Snowflake. Paw. Tap. The tiny marks left behind on glass. She had thought then that she was learning how to let joy remain small. Now she wondered whether she had only been practicing for loss. But loss, she knew, could not be allowed to become ownership. Juniper was not missing in the way a pet went missing. She was not supposed to belong to the clinic, or to Mara, or to any room with a latch. The woods were not theft. The woods were home. Still, the gate had opened before Mara could say goodbye. That was the thorn under every breath. For 6 days, they searched. Morning fog soaked their sleeves. Afternoon sun lifted steam from the logging road. Nights brought frost that silvered the grass and hardened every paw print into mystery. They left scent-free food near trail cameras and checked the footage with tired eyes. A raccoon visited twice and washed both paws in the water dish with great satisfaction. A porcupine wandered through one frame, looking like a walking bundle of old paintbrushes. Once, Button stepped in front of the clinic camera at midnight, eyes glowing like a tiny ghost, and Lena declared him unhelpful but committed. No Juniper. On the 7th morning, fresh snow fell. Only an inn. enough to cover old tracks. Enough to make the world look clean in a way that felt cruel. Mara stood at the tree line behind the repaired enclosure. The gate latch held firm beneath her hand. The blue blanket was folded in the recovery room again. The food bowl sat washed and empty on the shelf. Somewhere beyond the pines, a crow called. Mara listened until the sound faded. Then she whispered, "Be wild." Then. Her voice broke on the last word, but no one corrected it. 18 months taught Mara that hope could become part of a routine without ever becoming easy. At first, hope had been loud. It had woken her before dawn and sent her to the kitchen window before the kettle boiled. It had made her slow down at every bend on Moose Hollow Road, searching the ditch, the stone wall, the shoulder. Then summer came, and hope changed its clothes. The woods thickened. Ferns rose around the logging paths. Mosquitoes followed Lena inside. Button discovered that lying across the cool tile in reception caused people to step over him respectfully, which pleased him more than sleep itself. There were reports: a bobcat crossing a blueberry field at dawn, a female slipping over a stone wall, a flash of tufted ears near the creek in October. Eli checked what he could. Sometimes Mara went. Sometimes she stayed back, because chasing every shadow could wear grief down to something sharp and useless. She kept Juniper's old chart in the lower drawer beside release forms and winter intake logs. She did not open it every day. Only when the first snow came. Only when the faucet in recovery began its slow drip again. Only when she caught herself listening for scuff flap, though she had finally repaired the boot. Need did not pause because one bobcat was gone. A young raccoon once stole Mara S. pencil and held it with both paws, chewing the eraser while looking directly into her eyes. "You re not the first patient to object to paperwork," Mara told him. Lena laughed so hard she had to sit on the feed bucket. Those little moments saved the clinic in ways nobody charted. Mr. Bell replaced the north gate latch with a heavier one and tested it so often that Dr. Keene told him the latch would begin charging rent. Eli left firewood by Mara S. porch and pretended he had been driving past by coincidence. Amos grew older and rounder, and when Mara worked late, he waited beside her kitchen door with the solemn disappointment of a judge who had missed dinner by 4 minutes. Life did not become whole. It became livable. By the second March after Juniper disappeared, the clinic looked almost the same as it had the year before. The pines still leaned close. The recovery room windows still fogged at the corners. The blue blanket still sat folded on the upper shelf, faded now. Mara had tried to put it in storage once. She carried it to the supply closet, opened the door, looked at the dark space between cardboard boxes, and walked it back without explaining herself. No one asked. That evening, wet snow began falling just after 5. It was the kind of snow that seemed undecided whether it wanted to be rain, clinging to sleeves and lashes. Mara had stayed late to help Dr. Keene settle a recovering barred owl. Lena folded towels into uneven stacks. Mr. Bell had come by to fix a shelf and had somehow eaten the last 2 oatmeal cookies, claiming broken furniture required fuel. The clinic held the soft exhaustion of a long day ending. A kettle clicked off. The owl shifted under its sheet. Button sat in the hallway with one paw tucked, watching the recovery room door, as if waiting for the building to confess something. Mara was rinsing a feeding syringe when Lena whispered her name from the doorway. Not called. Whispered. Mara. The sound moved through Mara before thought did. She turned with the syringe still in her hand, water dripping from its tip onto the tile. Lena stood pale and still, one finger raised toward the recovery room. At first, Mara thought a patient had slipped a crate. Then she saw Dr. Keen in the hall, motionless with his glasses halfway down his nose. Mr. Bell stood behind him, holding a screwdriver, like he had forgotten what tools were for. Mara walked past them. The hallway floor gave its old dip beneath her left shoe. Not scuff flap anymore, just a soft creak. At the recovery room window, a shape stood outside in the falling snow. For one terrible, beautiful second, Mara's mind refused to name it. Naming would make it real, and real things could be lost again. The Bobcat was larger than Mara remembered, or perhaps the wild had filled every line of her. Her coat was thick from winter, mottled with gray and tawny shadow. Snow beaded along her whiskers. Her low aepte ear still carried the crescent tear, clean against the darkening trees. Her body stood low and ready, not weak, not cornered, not asking. Then she lifted one paw. The notched outer edge showed as she placed it against the glass. Mara stopped 3 steps away. The whole room seemed to fold around that paw. Dr. Keen removed his glasses and did not put them back on. Lena pressed a towel to her mouth. Mr. Bell looked down, then up, then down again, as if trying to give his tears somewhere private to go. Juniper's eyes held Mara's face. Not soft, not tame. Remembering. The Bobcat's ears turned once toward the owl's faint movement inside, then toward Button, who had become a round gray statue of offended wonder behind Mara's ankle. Button lifted one paw as if considering a reply through the glass, thought better of it, and sat down heavily. A fragile laugh moved through Lena's tears. Mara did not laugh. She could not yet. She thought of every mile of forest between then and now, every storm Juniper had survived without them, every cold dawn, every mouse trail, every hidden den, every night the clinic had gone dark while the Bobcat remained alive somewhere beyond its lights. Mara had wanted a goodbye. Instead, the wild had given her this, not possession, not return in the human sense, but a visit freely chosen. She took one step closer. Juniper did not move away. Mara stopped before the glass, leaving space even there. Her reflection hovered faintly over the Bobcat's face. Older now, more lined at the eyes, hair loosened from its knot. Juniper, she whispered. The Bobcat blinked once. Then her paw slid down the pane, leaving 4 clear trails through the fog and snowmelt, just as it had in the old recovery days, when flakes had landed and vanished under her careful touch. Outside, dusk deepened blue behind the pines. Inside, nobody reached for the latch. Nobody opened the door. Everyone understood that the miracle was not that Juniper had come back to be held. It was that she had come back at all. Juniper did not stay at the window long. That was the first lesson of her return, and perhaps the kindest one, though Mara did not understand that immediately. The Bobcat held Mara's gaze for several breaths, with her notched paw lowered into the wet snow and her ears turning to every small sound inside the clinic. Then a gust came through the pines, lifting loose flakes from the roof, and Juniper looked toward the tree line. Mara felt the old human wish rise in her, like a hand reaching without permission. Stay. She did not say it. Juniper stepped back from the glass. Her body moved with strength, but not ease. There was a stiffness along one hind leg, subtle enough that a stranger might have missed it. Mara saw it at once. Wildlife nurses noticed what love wanted to deny. The bobcat's ribs did not show, but her flanks were lean from winter, and when she paused near the low cedar at the edge of the yard, she lowered her head for a moment, as if the walk had cost her more than she wished to admit. Doctor. Keene saw it too. "Don't open the door," he murmured, though no one had moved toward it. Mara nodded. The words hurt anyway. Outside, Juniper slipped beneath the cedar shadows and disappeared. For several minutes the room remained as she had left it. Lena still held the towel against her mouth. Mr. Bell wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist and then pretended to inspect the window latch. Button approached the glass, sniffed the place where the paw had been, and gave one soft, puzzled chirp that made Lena laugh through a small sob. Mara touched the cold pane with 2 fingers, not over the mark, only beside it. The glass smelled faintly of damp wood and clinic soap. Snowmelt gathered at the sill. The paw trails were already fading. She was favoring the back leg, Mara said. Doctor. Keene put his glasses back on. No. They did not trap her. That decision became their next kind of care. Eli came before dark ended, after Mara called him with a voice steadier than her hands. He listened, looked at the tracks beneath the window, and crouched where Juniper had paused by the cedar. His flashlight made the snow glitter around the paw prints. She came in from the ridge, he said, not desperate, but tired. They set up a trail camera on the back slope and placed a small sheltered feeding station near the tree line, far from the building, where Juniper could choose to come or not come. No bright lights, no crowding, no calling into the woods. The bowl was placed at a respectful distance from the clinic, yet when Mara set it down, she measured 3 feet from the cedar trunk without thinking. The next morning, the food was gone. So was Juniper. A raccoon had not taken it. The camera showed the bobcat stepping from the dark at high den murbe silent as a thought. She sniffed the bowl, looked toward the recovery room window, then ate in quick, efficient bites, pausing between each one to scan the trees. Before leaving, she lifted her notched paw and touched the cedar trunk, spreading her toes against the bark. Lena watched the footage 3 times and whispered. She signed in. Mara smiled because it was easier than crying. For 5 nights, Juniper returned. Never at the same hour. Never by the same path. Sometimes the camera caught only a shoulder moving through ferns. Sometimes her pale eyes flashed once and vanished. Once, she sat beside the bowl for nearly 2 minutes, not eating, simply listening to the clinic's nighttime hum. Mara did not go outside to her. That was harder than any treatment had been. Her hands remembered the weight beneath the blanket on Route 7. Her ears remembered the tap of a paw against falling snow. Some part of her still imagined that if she stood beneath the porch light and spoke softly enough, Juniper might come near. But another, truer part of her knew that the glass had been the gift. The boundary had made the visit possible. So Mara cared from a distance. She checked the camera. She examined tracks. She adjusted the feeding station when rain pooled near it. She left no scent she could avoid. She asked Eli to walk the ridge and look for signs of the hind leg stiffness without pushing close. She called Dr. Keene when the footage showed Juniper crouching longer than usual, and he said gently, "Her body may be healing itself the way wild bodies sometimes do, if we don't to make her spend strength escaping us." Mara sat vekepite hat that sentence a long time. At home, Amos grew jealous of the late hours and began sleeping on her boot so she could not leave without negotiating. One night, he refused to move until Mara paid him with 3 chin scratches and the corner of her toast. At the clinic, Button appointed himself guardian of the recovery room window, though he fell asleep during most of his shifts. Lena taped a note beneath the trail camera monitor. "Juniper, watch. Please, Brett." Mara needed the reminder. On the 6th evening, rain washed the last snow from the yard. The world smelled of thawed earth, cedar bark, and cold water running beneath leaves. Mara stood inside the recovery room with the lights dimmed. The old blue blanket lay folded on the shelf behind her, untouched but near. The lower window reflected her face until movement outside made the reflection disappear. Juniper stood at the tree line. Not at the glass. Not close. Her body was a low, powerful shape between the pines. She placed weight on the hind leg more evenly now. Her left ear turned toward the road, then back toward Mara. The distance between them was full of everything they had survived. Mara lifted her hand only to rest it against her own chest. Juniper watched. Then the bobcat lowered her head, picked her way through wet fern stems, and moved into the woods without looking back again that night. Mara did not feel abandoned. Not exactly. She felt trusted with the ending of the visit. And in the quiet room, with Button snoring outside the door and Lena humming badly over the laundry, Mara understood that healing did not always mean bringing a body inside. Sometimes it meant keeping the light on, leaving the woods open, and letting the wild creature decide how close love was allowed to stand. For a while, Juniper became a visitor made of signs. The feeding station stayed beneath the cedar for 2 more weeks, then less often, then only after hard weather. Mara and Eli agreed on that. Support could turn into dependence if kindness forgot its limits, and neither wanted Juniper's life to shrink around a bowl near a human building. So the bowl appeared only on nights when ice sealed the ground or rain came cold enough. Most nights, it stayed washed and upside down on the clinic shelf. Juniper still passed through. A camera caught her along the ridge in April, stepping over a fallen birch, with the easy care of an animal who owns shadow and distance. In May, Eli found one print in soft mud near the creek, the notched edge clear as a remembered voice. In June, Mr. Bell swore he saw her cross the old fire road at dawn, but he had also been carrying 3 coffees and wearing fogged glasses, so Dr. Keene entered the sighting under probable and highly caffeinated. Mara smiled when she read it. By midsummer, the clinic smelled of cut grass, sun-warmed pine boards, and formula for orphaned fawns. Mosquitoes hummed against the screens. The recovery room window stood open, letting in crickets and the rush of leaves after sunset. The blue blanket remained folded on the shelf, not as bait, not as a shrine, but as part of the room's memory. Mara had grown better at not waiting. That did not mean she forgot. It meant she stopped standing at Moatfe windows as if the woods owed her an answer. It meant she drove Moose Hollow Road ve Kepite hot, her eyes on the road first and the ditches second. It meant she let laughter come when Button fell asleep inside an empty supply box, and Lena taped a note to the lid that read, "Fragile, contains management." Then, on a humid evening in late July, Juniper came back with 2 shadows behind her. Mara saw them from the laundry room. She had been folding towels, while thunderheads built over the western ridge, turning the light green at the edges. The air smelled of wet leaves before the rain had arrived. Outside, beyond the slope, the ferns stood waist-high and shining. Something moved between them, low and smooth. Mara stopped with a towel in her hands. Juniper emerged first at the tree line. She looked leaner in summer, her coat shorter, her markings sharper, her crescent-torn ear unmistakable against the dark spruce. She did not come toward the window. She stood beneath the old cedar, head lifted, mouth slightly parted as she tasted the air. Her notched paw rested on a mossy root. Behind her, the ferns trembled. One small bobcat appeared. Then another. They were not tiny kittens. They were old enough to follow, mostly legs, ears, and suspicion, but young enough that their paws still seemed too large for their bodies. One had a darker face mask and a white splash under the chin. The other carried a bent whisker on the right side, sticking out at a comic angle that made Lena later whisper, "That one woke up dramatic." Mara did not move. Her heart became very quiet. Juniper S. Young stayed behind her shoulder. They copied her stillness, though not perfectly. The darker one crouched so low only the ear tips showed above the ferns. The bent whisker youngster tried to look severe, then became distracted by a beetle climbing a grass stem and swatted once with silent concentration. Mara pressed the folded towel to her chest. A warmth rose in the room so gently it almost hurt. Juniper had survived, more than survived. She had made a life large enough to carry forward. All those months of not knowing, all those winter worries and fading tracks had led to this evening, the wild bobcat at the edge of the clinic yard, showing only the fierce ordinary truth of motherhood. Doctor. Keen appeared beside Mara and understood at once. He lifted one hand to stop Lena from rushing closer, though Lena had already frozen vacapite, hot both hands over her mouth. "Mister." Belle came in from the back hall, holding a wrench, and whispered, "Oh, would you look at that?" in a voice so soft the words barely survived. Button, sensing history, leapt onto the windowsill from the inside, misjudged the distance, and arrived with his back half slower than his front. He recovered by sitting very straight and pretending that was the plan. The bent whisker youngster stared at him through the glass. Button stared back. Neither species seemed impressed. Juniper turned her head toward the commotion. Everyone stilled. Her eyes found Mara. There was no paw against the glass this time, no old window game, no sign made for human understanding. Juniper simply looked, and in that look, Mara felt the boundary being drawn with grace. These young belonged to the woods. They were not patients. They were not visitors to be named and softened by human voices. They were Juniper quiet, offering to the place that had once kept her alive. Mara stepped back from the window. It was instinct now, almost prayer. Give them room. Outside, Juniper lowered her head and made a small sound, too low for the people inside to hear clearly. The youngsters responded at once. The darker one rose from the ferns. The bent whisker one abandoned the beetle with regret. They followed their mother along the tree line, their spotted bodies appearing and vanishing through green fronds and spruce shade. Just before Juniper disappeared, she paused beneath the cedar. For a heartbeat, she lifted her notched paw and set it on the root, where the winter feeding bowl had once stood 3 feet from the trunk. Then she moved on. No one spoke until the ferns were still again. Lena cried quietly into a towel she had been supposed to fold. Doctor. Keen removed his glasses and cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, although they were not dirty. Belle cleared his throat and said the gate latch needed checking, then walked in the wrong direction. Mara stayed by the window. She did not feel the old ache in the same way. It was still there, but changed, widened by wonder. She had once feared that letting Juniper go meant becoming empty again. Now she saw that love released into the wild did not always vanish. Sometimes it returned with 2 young lives in the ferns, stayed just long enough to be believed, and left before anyone could make it smaller than it was. After that July evening, nobody at the clinic spoke of Juniper as if she had returned to them. They learned to say she passed through. It was a better phrase. Softer at the edges, truer to the way she lived. By late summer, the ferns behind the clinic grew high enough to hide everything but the movement of ears. Goldenrod brightened the ditch along Moose Hollow Road. The pines gave off a warm resin smell in the afternoons, and crickets filled the dark with a steady, stitched-together song. Juniper and her 2 young appeared only in pieces. One shadow at the ridge, one quick flash of white under a chin, one bent whisker caught by the trail camera when a young face leaned too close to inspect the strange black box tied to a birch. Lena printed that picture and taped it inside the staff room cabinet. Not on the wall. Not where visitors would ask. Inside the cabinet, behind the tea tins, where only the people who already understood would find it. The bent whisker youngster became known only as the inspector, though Mara never wrote that anywhere official. The darker one was the shadow, because even the camera caught more absence than body. Juniper remained Juniper inside the clinic, though Mara knew the name belonged to humans. Out in the woods, the Bobcat carried other identities: mother, hunter, trespasser of stone walls, keeper of roots no person could map. As the months turned, the rhythm settled. The bowl stayed put away unless weather grew hard. That rule mattered. Mara repeated it gently when new volunteers came and saw the photographs. Love did not mean making wild animals comfortable near people. Love meant helping only enough, then stepping back before kindness became a cage with no bars. When the first freezing rain came in November, Mara placed the bowl beneath the cedar again. She did it near dusk. The yard smelled of ice and wet leaves. Every branch wore a clear shining skin, and the old gate latch clicked cold beneath her glove when she checked it. She set the bowl 3 feet from the cedar trunk, tucked beneath the low boughs where sleet would not fill it too quickly. Then she walked back inside without looking over her shoulder. By morning, the food was gone. The trail camera showed Juniper arriving at Ba den Bon Amo alone. She sniffed the bowl, looked toward the clinic window, and then turned her head sharply toward the ridge before eating. Her ears never stopped moving. Twice she paused with one paw raised, listening to something no human microphone caught. When she finished, she did not linger. She stepped around the cedar, rubbed her cheek once against the bark, and vanished. Mara watched the clip with her hands around the loon mug. The mug had gained another chip near the handle. Doctor. Keen noticed and said, "That bird has had a difficult career." "It's still flying," Mara said. He looked at the painted loon, now missing most of its beak and a little of its wing, and nodded as if that was a medical fact worth respecting. Winter came slowly, then all at once. Snow packed itself along the fence line. The birches went white and thin. The recovery room window fogged at Moat 5 the corners just like it had before, and sometimes Mara found herself looking for a paw mark that was not there. Button grew rounder, as though preparing for a season of administrative burden. He chose a new sleeping place in the empty paper towel box and became so pleased with it that Lena wrote management office across the flap. The clinic laughed, more than it had the winter Juniper disappeared. That surprised Mara. Not because grief was gone. It was not. But it had found its proper size. It no longer filled every room. It sat quietly beside the other things: clean bowls, repaired latches, fresh towels, warm hands, and the steady work of helping what could be helped. Juniper passed through 3 times that winter that they knew of. Once during a storm, when the camera showed only her back half and the sweep of her short tail. Once at dawn, when Mr. Bell arrived early and saw her standing by the cedar, snow on her whiskers, calm as a secret. He stayed in his truck until she left, then came inside and pretended he had been waiting for the heater to warm up. His eyes gave him away. The 3rd time was on a moonlit night in January. Mara was alone at the clinic with a sleeping owl, 2 young opossums, and Button, who had wedged himself so tightly into his box that only his tail showed. The cold outside was deep enough to make the building creak. The stars looked hard and close over the pines. Mara heard nothing. She only felt the shift that sometimes came when a wild thing entered the edge of human light. She turned from the sink and looked through the recovery room window. Juniper stood beyond the glass, farther back than she had on the night of her return. Not at the pain, not asking, simply present beneath the cedar, with moonlight pale along her shoulders and her torn ear tipped toward the woods. Mara did not go closer. The old part of her wanted to. The wiser part stayed still. "Good evening," she whispered. Juniper lowered her head and sniffed the snow where the bowl sometimes sat. There was no bowl that night. The weather had been clear, and hunting would have been possible. Juniper seemed to understand the absence. She pawed once at the snow, not with complaint, but with the old testing motion Mara remembered from the water pan, the window, the cedar root. Then she looked up. For a breath, they shared the distance. Mara thought of the gate latch, replaced and checked, yet no longer a symbol of failure. She thought of the blue blanket folded on the shelf, no longer a plea. She thought of her own house, where the yellow room door now stood open, more often than closed, and Amma slept on the quilt whenever sunlight found it. Some bonds did not bring a life nearer. Some bonds made it possible to let a life remain far and still feel blessed by it. Juniper turned and slipped back between the trees. The snow took her soundlessly. Mara waited until the woods were empty again, then rinsed the clean bowl waiting on the counter, dried it, and placed it upside down on the shelf. Ready if needed, untouched if not. Years passed, and the clinic learned to hold Juniper's story lightly. Not loosely, never carelessly. Lightly, the way Mara held a young bird during an exam, with enough steadiness to protect it and enough gentleness to let it breathe. Moose Hollow changed in ordinary ways. The old cedar behind the clinic lost one large branch in a February storm, and Mr. Bell trimmed the broken edge smooth while muttering that trees had no respect for maintenance schedules. Lena finished her training and became a full wildlife technician, though she still wrote notes round enough to make even medication labels seem kind. Dr. Keene retired his trout socks only after one heel opened so wide that Mara told him the fish had escaped. Button grew old in the reception room, slower and wider, but still convinced that every box delivered to the clinic had arrived for his professional inspection. He spent most afternoons in a sun patch below the front desk, one paw over his nose, while visitors whispered around him as if he were a sleeping director. At home, Amos also slowed. He became less of a retired mayor and more of a small orange king who preferred his meals brought close. Mara kept his chair opposite hers. She still ate soup at the kitchen table on cold nights, but the house no longer felt quite as hollow. The yellow room door stayed open. Sunlight crossed the old quilt in the afternoons. Sometimes Mara sat there to mend towels, and Amos came in to judge the stitches. She never adopted a child. She never filled the room the way she had once imagined. But life, with its quiet mercy, filled corners she had stopped asking it to fill. The blue blanket remained at the clinic. By then it was too worn for use. One edge had frayed. The color had faded from deep lake blue to something softer, like evening snow. Mara folded it on the recovery room shelf near the window. Not where patients could reach it, not where it would carry scent into another animal's care, but where it belonged to memory without becoming a trap. New volunteers sometimes ask about it. Lena usually answered before Mara had to. "That one taught us distance," she would say. Mara would smile, because it was true, though not the whole truth. Juniper was seen less often as the years moved on. Trail cameras caught her the winter after her young dispersed, then once again in early spring, crossing the ridge alone beneath sleet-heavy branches. The crescent tear in her left ear showed clearly. The notched paw touched snow, lifted, vanished. After that, sightings became stories from neighbors. A bobcat near the blueberry field, a shadow slipping over a wall, pale eyes at the edge of a logging road. Mara listened to each one ve kepite hat care. She did not chase them. That was how she knew she had changed. The first version of her love had wanted proof. Paw prints. Camera frames. A shape outside glass. The later version wanted only enough good news to imagine Juniper still moving through the world, alive in the deep privacy of her kind. One evening, many winters after the paw first touched the window, snow began falling before closing. Mara was alone in the recovery room, rinsing bowls beneath the old dripping faucet. The sink still made its patient sound. One drop, then another. The air smelled of clean towels, peppermint tea, and cold glass. Outside, the cedar stood black against the dim yard. The repaired gate latch gleamed under a sleeve of frost. No bowl waited beneath the tree that night. The weather was mild enough, and the woods were full of hidden lives. Mara dried her hands and looked toward the window. For a moment, she imagined it again. The broad paw against the pane, the damp pads, the 4 trails through fog, the pale green eyes beyond the glass, not tame, not pleading, only remembering. She stepped closer, stopping where the old floorboard gave its familiar creak. The sound had once brought Juniper to attention. Now it only made the room answer with its own quiet. Mara placed 2 fingers beside the place where the paw had been years before. The glass was cold enough to sting. Snowflakes touched the outside and vanished. She did not feel sorrow exactly. Sorrow was there, but it had become braided with gratitude, and gratitude had become stronger. Behind her, Button S. successor, a solemn black and white clinic cat named Mabel, knocked a roll of bandage from the counter, and then looked personally wounded by gravity. Mara turned and laughed softly. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Mabel flicked her tail, unconvinced. That small foolishness warmed the room. Mara picked up the bandage, set it back, and checked the patient board. A young owl needed release at dawn. A fox with a healing foot would move to the outdoor enclosure in 2 days. A fawn, now strong enough to be rude about bottles, had finally learned to stand without wobbling into the wall. Life kept arriving frightened. Life kept leaving when it could. Before turning out the light, Mara unfolded the blue blanket once. She did not know why she did it that night, perhaps because of the snow, Perhaps because memory sometimes asked to be held briefly, then put away again. The fabric smelled only faintly of clean storage now. No wild musk, no cedar rain, no living warmth. But when she ran her thumb along the worn edge, she remembered the roadside, the water pan, the window game, the storm, the empty tracks, the return. Most of all, she remembered the lesson Juniper had given without meaning to. Love did not always close the distance. Sometimes love kept the distance safe. Mara folded the blanket carefully and placed it back on the shelf. Then she turned off the recovery room light, leaving only the porch lamp glowing outside. Snow fell through that small circle of gold. No bobcat came to the window. And still, somehow, the room felt visited. The night settled gently over Moose Hollow, and the clinic became a small, warm square at the edge of the dark woods. The cedar held its snow. The latch held firm. The old window cooled under the touch of passing flakes, each one appearing for a breath before becoming water and slipping away. Somewhere beyond the ridge, there may have been a bobcat trail hidden beneath spruce shadow. Perhaps Juniper had crossed it long ago, with her young behind her. Perhaps one of those young had grown into the silence of the forest and carried, in the shape of a paw or the tilt of an ear, something no person would ever know how to name. Mara did not need to know. That was the peace she had earned slowly. She had learned that the wild did not return because humans deserved it. It returned when it chose, and sometimes only once, and sometimes only long enough to leave a mark on glass. But one mark could be enough. One quiet paw against a window could change the way a woman understood goodbye for the rest of her life. So if you are listening now, let the room around you grow soft for a moment. Think of the animals that passed through your life and left you kinder. Think of the ones you could not keep, the ones you still remember at windows, roadsides, porches, barns, or garden gates. Some love stayed beside you. Some love walked back into the trees. Both kinds mattered. Thank you for staying Vekepite Hot Mara and Juniper through the snow, the rain, the waiting, and the return. May your night be gentle. May your heart rest easily. And somewhere, beyond the last porch light, may a wild paw touch fresh snow and leave its quiet sign before the forest covers it again. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.